When I began hearing about Iraq was when I found out through my contacts in the Pentagon that we had diverted resources from the conflict in Afghanistan and from going after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to Iraq. There were a number of motivations for this war, and those motivations generally encircled or came from a small group of people, whether they were ideological motivations coming from, as we know now, the neocons like Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, and a host of others who participated with them in promoting this war, or whether they were coming from people who were very interested in the vast oil reserves that not only are there in Iraq now, known and provable, but increasingly we think may be in the western deserts even more than Saudi Arabia has. They may be vast reserves in Iraq. At the same time, you've got people who are motivated to conflict, as it were, by the fact that their share price, like Lockheed Martin's, goes from $26 to $98 in the course of the conflict, and lots of money pours down their coffers. You also had a group that I call the ultra-nationalists, and I would include Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, not in the neocon cabal, but in the ultra-nationalist cabal. And what I mean by ultra-nationalists is, to hell with the rest of the world, America first, second, and third. Everything that needs to be done in the world can be done through American power, the astute, brilliant application of that power. That's Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. I've not mentioned one other motivation in here, which was, I think, very much at work, and that's Israel. I do believe that Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Defense Department, Douglas Feith, for example, as many people often said in the State Department, including the highest members of the State Department, was a card-carrying member of the Likud party. Now, that didn't mean that if you took his wallet out, you'd find a card identifying him as a member of the Likud party. What it meant, of course, was that he had a double set of interests in mind at most times, and those interests were not just America's interests, they were Israel's interests. And so that was a motivation too, because certain of these people, like Feith, like Pearl, thought that if the United States was in Baghdad, if the United States could create a favorable government in Baghdad, favorable in terms that it looked at the United States and Israel with favorable interest, then Israel's situation, security situation in particular in the Middle East, would be enhanced 100-fold. There are a group of people in this country who have an interest in Israel's security that goes beyond America's interests. Increasingly, I think, Americans who think about these issues, and unfortunately that's not very many, are beginning to worry deeply in some cases about where our republic's headed, where our democracy is headed. We have increasingly given the ability to go to war, to send young men and young women to die for state purposes, and to kill other people for state purposes, as we're doing in Iraq today. We're giving that power exclusively to the President of the United States. So that's the first problem, is the President increasingly turns to the military instrument to solve problems. The second problem is associated with the politics of fear. The American people get so fearful for their own security that they allow their chief executive, the President, to do almost anything, to wiretap, to abuse and torture prisoners. It's appalling sometimes to look at the polling data, polls that you trust because the questions are asked properly and so forth, and see how many Americans actually support what this president has done and what he was doing with regard to those issues, torture and so forth. We are so fearful of our own security that we're willing to tolerate a tyrant in Washington. That's what it amounts to. Well, tyranny breeds its own problems. It breeds its own aftermath, if you will. So we're moving away rapidly from all those things, the Constitution, the rule of law, operating within our own revenues instead of debt, and so forth, all because the presidency has become so powerful that it can do these things, and it has become powerful in some respects because of the politics of fear, the fact that Americans want to be safe, they want to be kept away from this possibility of a Walmart lobby exploding, you know. They want to be kept away from another 9/11 and so forth. That's understandable. But forfeit your civil liberties, forfeit your republic, forfeit your democracy for those things? I hardly think that's the right choice.